So yesterday, we're getting prepared to go to the Convention on Biological Diversity. The 16th Conference of the Parties is coming up in Colombia next week. It starts. And I attended a meeting on how to prepare, and my colleagues showed this wonderful film of a moving speech by Colombia's dynamic Minister of the Environment, Susana Mohamed Gonzalez. And one thing she said really struck me. She said it's all about re-centralizing nature and the way we think and the way we make our decisions. And it's like, it struck me as that little arrow on our phones that you can put to recenter yourself when you get lost looking throughout that map for lunch or a better route. And then you hit that button and you're back when you go astray. And I also pictured, right, we've been basically pushing nature away. We've been putting it to the side. We've been paving over it. We've been plowing through it to get what we need to tame the beautiful, extraordinary nature that we have by creating beautiful and extraordinary constructions that humankind has devised to connect us, to nourish us, to entertain us, and to sustain us. So we have the extraordinary infrastructure being built to deliver our needs, but we're going through nature. We're putting it aside. We're not centering it. And that's because, for all of the time that humans have been able to ingeniously address their needs, they've always seen the world as having someplace else to go, just over the horizon or the next frontier. We can get more resources over there, more water to clean away our mistakes, more space to move into and dump our waste and disperse our pollution. But as everybody knows, right now, we're facing the reality that there's nowhere else to go now. No more frontiers. Every inch of space we have on our maps is precious and has a purpose and can't be squandered. There is no more room for error. Yet, we're also speaking at the same time of some predictions that one that I always quote because it never ceases to amaze me is that we plan to build 75% more infrastructure on Earth than we have today. All of that in only 26 years or so by 2050. This is what we aspire to so that we can maintain our thriving way of life. And it's also what we need to build to address our sustainable development goals. And to that great number, I have two reactions. One is awe, and the other is optimism. The awe is, wow, 75, that means we only have 25% now, and we feel crowded. We feel like there's not that much more space to move into. Where is all this new infrastructure actually going to go? And those cities are just going to get larger, and the intact nature we have around us is going to slip away to put in all that extra infrastructure. Not extra, probably needed. But on the other hand, optimism. There's a real opportunity in this number, this 75%, because that 75% is not here yet. And it won't be here tomorrow either. So we have time. We have time that we need to use wisely to get that construction right, to get that delivery of ecosystem services via nature right and protected. And to do all that, we really do need to do, as the minister advises, re-centralize the role nature plays and must play in how we organize our space and how we get our connectivity for the services we need to reach our future goals. And we need to think about pushing aside nature at our peril. It won't do us any good to continue to undermine, pave over, and plow through nature because there's nowhere else to go when we make a mistake. And I always also think about infrastructure as there used to be a commercial about diamonds in my childhood. Diamonds are forever. Well, infrastructure is pretty much forever. We rarely take it back. And once it's in, It has very huge consequences for the space around it. Roads beget towns, beget agriculture, and continue to grow. And we are still using the Roman roads in Europe that were built thousands of years ago. We don't take infrastructure back. It becomes permanent and therefore no room for error. So how can we bring nature back into the center of our lives and of delivering the infrastructure services we need? Well, the answer lies in data. Of course. I mean, what's not to love about data? It comforts us, it guides us, it gives us confidence, it makes us feel safe, it allows us to make decisions about moving forward. To recenter nature in our lives can help us restore the planet's planet's health and its biodiversity needs. Biodiversity is central, and we're taking into account how biodiversity system works, the functionality of that system. If we start to understand nature's engineering and how it functions, we then can build the infrastructure we need or take advantage of and support the infrastructure nature is already providing to us to meet our needs into the future. So I see three factors in how we should be starting to think about this, or already are. One is that the infrastructure sector seems to fear biodiversity and its data. And thus it's pushing it aside, and it's been doing that for too long. This sector, on the other hand, really needs to embrace biodiversity, because if we can see the value in enhancing biodiversity, that will actually enable more reliable performance of our infrastructure over the long term. And third, both the infrastructure and the science and conservation communities need to perform together to get this balance right. We need to work together and continue high performance functional capacity that will get this balance right for our future. So back to fear. What do I mean by that? I'm thinking of the engineer and the developer, the fear of the unknown. The fear that if we assess the biodiversity in that right of way down the road, or where we plan to put that dam, we'll find a little fish or a cute owl or some sage grouse that will stop everything. It's happened before, and it causes huge trouble for a continuing engineering project to find an endangered species in your space. So is there any way that we cannot find that? Is there any way to avoid that? Do we really need to do another thing, 2 years of time to assess the biodiversity? That brings on a fear of receding time horizons. If we really have to do a proper assessment for 2 years, that means 2 years that we can't be building, which brings the fear of expense. The notion that having a biodiversity positive approach to designing something is going to take up a lot more of a budget, both in the time it takes to do all this assessment, but also building extra things like wildlife overpasses and so forth. Of course, all of that is going to cost too much. And all those kinds of fears have tended, again, to push biodiversity to the side, to not allow it to come in and be valued as a central piece of designing a piece of infrastructure. But maybe we should think of it in the other direction. Maybe we should fear failure more than these costs upfront in the design of some infrastructure development. By that failure, I'm talking about the failure to appreciate and account for the biodiversity and ecosystem services that are actually securing a positive performance of our infrastructure, especially over the long term. Of course, infrastructure development, the highest risk is at the earliest stages of the design, but the highest gains are at the earliest stages of the design. That's where you can make choices about the construction, especially where to put it and how to design it and what materials to use, that will end up serving over the longest time those hundreds or maybe thousands of years of securing a safe and reliable piece of infrastructure. And what I mean by the reasoning behind assessing biodiversity and ecosystem services, we're seeing all around us now. It's about the resilience of ecosystems that are already securing a biodiversity function that we value, like avoidance of flooding and landslides and sedimentation and water quality, all coming from intact ecosystems, maybe 2 or 3 mountains away from the right of way of your infrastructure. Which leads me to another point. Are we limiting the biodiversity that we think we need to assess when we're looking at creating infrastructure by only looking at the biodiversity straight ahead on a right of way? I feel like we need to have a much broader perspective and actually make it the norm to look at the data across a landscape and understand how nature is functioning across a landscape, and that information also needs to be incorporated into the design of the infrastructure we need. But who is going to be responsible for all of that? There's a crowd of people that need to be engaging together more than they are right now to bring biodiversity related data together with precipitation data, land use data, other types of investment that's already happening in that space that will only compound the impacts of biodiversity. And this kind of cross-ministerial, public-private, NGO, academia, community, government interaction is increasing. More and more people are looking at this. And one place I've seen this driven by disasters is in the Philippines, where they experience disasters regularly. And one of my favorite examples of this pulling together of data is something called the Hazard Hunter Philippines. You look it up on the web, hazardhunter.ph. And this is one case, and I haven't seen this before, and many others may tell me otherwise, but many different ministries within that same government have agreed to put their real-time data together into an app based on LiDAR detailed base map that shows elevation to the inch. And you can point your pointer at any place in the map and know if you're close to a fault line, are you close to a volcanic eruption pathway, are you in a flood zone, are you in a crisis zone during cyclones, are you in a landslide zone? All of these factors that drive good decision making are in this app coming from all these directions. So the cooperation across these ministries is amazing, and it's real-time data, and it's user-friendly. And I dream of having that kind of data coming together everywhere so that people can make decisions in real time using all that AI, all that machine learning, and all that fantastic data producers like the LiDAR tool to provide a great foundation of integrated data, comprehensive data that will inform these most impactful of decisions like large infrastructure development. A second part of understanding what kind of data we need is that the future data of infrastructure needs to be based on dynamic data. Static maps, yes, here, presence of animals here, no longer works. Everything's in motion. Nature's always in motion. There is always a flow. But because of climate change, that flow is increasing. It's moving entire habitats. I no longer have white oaks. We've cut down the most insect-rich trees in our neighborhood in the past 2 years, and I was told it's because it's just too hot. They're being replaced by adaptive trees that just don't attract the same insects. So our whole system's going to change because that one tree can't survive here anymore already. And if nature is moving, then we can't build the infrastructure of our future on data of the past. So we have a project in Asia, in Mongolia, and India and Nepal, where they're helping the government build the safeguards for biodiversity into linear infrastructure development funded by the United States Agency for International Development, and helping countries develop this dynamic data, which includes camera trapping of wildlife, collaring of animals, and understanding the patterns in real time that animals are actually using to get their resources, the connectivity they need to be sustained. Then that information needs to be fed into the new design of infrastructure in the future in a way, ideally, that's much more flexible and more permeable than the type of infrastructure we build, which is usually a barrier. And so if we can think about nature and build in that dynamic nature, the dynamic data, we can anticipate the impact that infrastructure will have on the space in the future and how that nature in that space is going to continue to secure the safety of the investments that we have. And so this flow is got to be centralized into the way we think, which is pretty much the opposite of the way we think of infrastructure. We like it to be flat and permanent and always there for us. But nature is showing us that we really need to be adjusted and adjustable in the way we approach things. And finally, once that kind of security is built in and designed, there will be more confidence in the investment world. And how do we generate to come in and invest in these sustainable assets? Because they're there and we can have confidence, and the data shows that they are more secure investments for the long term. But how do we generate all of this new infrastructure, taking these issues into account, when the current way of educating the practitioners still resides in a static past for the most part? So another project that we're doing under the same project align is finding out that in these countries, the engineering schools, the planning schools, even the forestry schools are lapping up this information. They recognize that if they can build it into their basic education, and out comes a new era of professionals who understand and have already built in to their engineering experience how to incorporate nature's data, nature at the center of their design, will then start to see the types of infrastructure that can be sustained into the long term and will breed the confidence of the investment world. And the investors want to invest in sustainable options. They're looking for sustainable options. They need data to show them which assets out there are sustainable. They're not confident that they can find that yet. We've been finding through other studies. They want to be able to hire consultants that can tell them how to be safe in an infrastructure investment when it comes to biodiversity, and not end up with a stranded asset because the birds are passing during one season of the year and your wind turbines are just not going to be able to be turned on. That's a disaster. Could have been avoided. Data was needed. Data wasn't provided. How can they avoid those mistakes? By having the engineering community and the communities and the policies take on the biodiversity data in their country, internalize it into their project designs, and produce the infrastructure that we need that is no longer going to undermine the biodiversity that we also need for our long-term survival on this planet. So it's a combination of getting the data right, looking at the right scale of data, understanding that the data has to be seen as a dynamic modeling type of data, no longer is a static map appropriate. All that needs to be built into education, all that needs to be generating new assets. Investors will come, the infrastructure we need will happen, and everybody's going to be happy. Wow, that was a very simplistic ending to this story. But it is clear that if many of those factors I mentioned happen, we will be able to build the infrastructure we need and live in harmony with nature and maintain its benefits and secure its beauty for the future of all of our children, grandchildren, and future generations, because infrastructure lasts. We have to get it right now. So thank you very much. This is going to be a great talk. There's so much to learn here today, so enjoy.
Thank you so much, Kate. And it's always a great experience hearing you speak. I will now quickly jump on towards panel discussion in the interest of time. Our first panelist, Ash Welch, is the Biodiversity Nature Positive Lead at AECOM Singapore, where he aids in the design of nature-based solutions and habitat restoration, in addition to delivering nature and biodiversity ESG-related services. Um, I'll be posing a question to Ash soon. Introducing our second panelist, Stacey Baggaley, is the principal specialist for nature in business within the nature economy impact area at the UNEP-WCMC. Through her role, Stacey is helping businesses integrate nature within their business portfolios and also provides technical and operational oversight to the Proteus partnership, which Stacey will be introducing in a bit as well. And our third panelist for this discussion is Diego Bignoli, who is an independent biodiversity consultant. His areas of expertise include protected areas science, biodiversity impact assessment, and application of biodiversity conservation related standards, methods, and tools. Previously, Diego has worked for IUCN and UNEP-WCMC, where he was creating or publishing the IUCN Red List of threatened species and on the World Database on Protected Areas. Diego was also the chief editor of a book published under UNEP-WCMC's Development Corridors project, which gave global best practice guidance on conducting effective environmental impact assessments that Diego will be talking about. Now that I've introduced the panelists, I will now get the discussion started by throwing the ball towards Ash, where I'd like to know the usage of tools such as Encore and IBAT, how these tools have helped you, Ash, in the screening of portfolio level nature risks, and more importantly, how important were these tools in the ENFD pilot that was conducted by AECOM earlier this year?
Yeah, okay. So thanks, Hamza. So I mean, for context for people listening to this, if they don't know who AECOM are, AECOM is a big infrastructure consultancy. So most of our clients are developing infrastructure of some sort. So we have, going back to what Kate was talking about earlier, we have a huge role to play to encourage our clients to do more and consider nature as a nature-based solution to provide resilience and so on. So we are very much trying to encourage our clients to consider risks and dependencies related to nature. And we're doing that through, TNFD assessments with corporate clients. We're also trying to do it through other work streams. So through more traditional development project workflows as well. So going back to your question on IBAN Encore, we have used it on TNFD assessments. And I think that's where it's currently being used quite predominantly at the moment, in my experience. And we have various different clients coming to us actively asking to use IBAT and Encore as part of these assessments. So I think word of mouth has got around that they are quite useful resources to use. And when it comes to TNFD, in particular around the first initial stages of that process, so the locate and assess phases of the LEAP process. And that's because they are pretty good data sets and resources for undertaking that initial analysis. So when you look at some of these global data sets that are open source that people can use, there is a huge variation in the quality of them. And I think like some of the IBAT data, which comes from IUCN, and then the Encore data as well, can then help to think about dependencies, which there's not really much out there at the moment in the way of nature-related data sets, which does that. So using a combination of those in TNFD assessments is really useful. The flip side is that we're now trying to get this process and embed it more into EIAs and development projects. So encouraging our engineers to do it, which is where the TNFD pilot came about for infrastructure. So I'll share my screen. I have a few slides just to contextualize what was done for the audience. So basically, the pilot that we did, which was published earlier this year, was an initiation from Global Canopy. And so in collaboration with Nature-Based Insights, AECOM worked upon basically this pilot to assess how the TNFD LEAP approach could be applied to infrastructure projects. So at the moment, most people or most companies are using TNFD at the portfolio level to assess their operational sites. What we try to do is to understand how could we use this approach through infrastructure projects before they have been built. So can we use it to alter and improve the EIA process and all of the checks and balances that are done prior to infrastructure being built? And so that's effectively what we did. And so we used a range of different data sets, which included both IBAP and the Encore resource. And what we did is, I'm based in Asia, so and because AECOM has such a large number of infrastructure projects, we found we have lots of existing data from EIAs and other environmental assessments for those infrastructure projects. We decided to retrospectively assess how well those projects would perform if we reapplied the TNFD approach. And so to do this, we obviously had some of the existing EIA data for those projects, and we compared and contrasted it to how the TNFD approach would work with that data, plus these global data sets that everybody's starting to use. And there's an indication of some of those on the screen. And then we tried to work out how Encore could be used as well to assess some of the dependencies and impacts that might come out from different industries developing new infrastructure. And effectively, the whole idea was about identifying gaps in the existing development project process and then working out how the TNFD LEAP approach could improve that. And we have some really interesting learnings, but I'll just very quickly show you how it works. So there were over 15 different data sets that were looked at, and these were effectively categorized into 8 categories. And you can see them on the side there. So biodiversity importance, integrity, extent, ecosystem change, water stress, and so on. These are all categories that are well defined by TNFD and which TNFD suggests we look at. If we compare this to the typical EIA process, then that is very different in different jurisdictions across Asia and across the world. So for our projects in Asia, we had 10 in total. We don't disclose the locations of the projects on here, but we had projects in India, Bangladesh, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Vietnam, and several other countries as well, Taiwan also. And you can see those categories at the top. And effectively using the data sets, there was a ranking process was applied to see how well it performed. And you can see that the green dots is obviously where it's performed well, the red dots is where it's performed less well. And you can see that there's quite a variable range of results. And I guess this is kind of what you would expect to see. You would expect some to perform well in places where you're collecting a lot more data and potentially you've selected a less controversial location, which is going to result in more impacts and more dependency risks. Whereas others maybe hasn't done that to the same extent. And so we did learn quite a few things from this process. Obviously, if you were to kickstart and use the TNFD process in an infrastructure project which is being planned and designed, then you probably wouldn't necessarily use just those global data sets. You would have and go out and collect your own data, which could supplement that. So the approach we took would be slightly different as if you applied it on a new project. But what we were trying to demonstrate was that it can, I mean, this entire process, and when we speak to clients, can be quite overwhelming. I think a lot of people are still grappling and trying to understand how nature really, why nature is important for their business. And I think this process can help contextualize it a lot better than some of the EIA processes, which to them sometimes feel like a burden, is the sort of impression I get from a lot of clients. It's just a tick boxing exercise. So in terms of the learnings we found, we did find that, many of these global data sets do have their own limitations. Some of them are just very vast in terms of the areas that you're looking in, and sometimes your project is very small. So you don't necessarily get the granular detail, but what they can do is provide you with a lot more holistic context and actually help you go above and beyond what the existing processes allow you to do. And you also start to look at things that you wouldn't have necessarily considered before, like ecosystem services, like the dependencies that come back to the infrastructure and provide that resilience. And it just helps you to consider the projects in the context of long-termism. Whereas a lot of infrastructure projects at the moment, you're considering the short-term impacts. You're not really considering the long-term impacts, and you're definitely not considering the dependencies on nature. And that's where tools like Encore come in really handy. It's a completely different approach, and I don't believe too many people have applied it to infrastructure projects yet. Hence why this was a really interesting pilot. But what we've sort of committed to doing is trying to now instill this process in our existing project portfolios and trying to really then work out how TNFD could positively encourage our clients to go beyond the existing status quo and really start to target nature positive contributions. So that's what we've been doing. One other thing that we've been doing, which is slightly aside to this pilot, is we actually create a range of different tools for our clients to use. And very recently, we have been, in collaboration with the Sustainable Markets Initiative, created a data aggregation tool for nature-based risks. And it brings a lot of these global data sets together in one place. And what we've realized in the feedback process from working with people that have piloted that data set is that they want IVAP and they want Encore embedded into these new tools because they are such useful data sets. And what we're looking to do with that is to try and use things like large language models and AI to really help contextualize that data so that people who aren't necessarily sustainability or ecology experts like some of us on the panel can really start to understand how it might impact their infrastructure projects before it gets to the EIA stage. It gets to these stages where sometimes, unfortunately, it's a bit too late because you haven't considered all of those impacts and dependencies. So I'm hoping that changes in practices and then also tools like this can really help people start to take those more positive approaches.
Thank you, Ash. With that, and in the interest of time, I will take that opportunity to now move towards Stacey. Stacey, it would be good if you could introduce the Proteus partnership to the audience and also share how the Proteus partnership can enable businesses to take action on biodiversity.
Thanks, Hamza. Hopefully, I think I'm coming through. I will just share screen as well. So just give me 1 second. So I guess firstly, just to introduce UNEP-WCMC a little for those in the audience who are less familiar with our organisation. Essentially, we work as a biodiversity specialist centre and we work with a range of different decision makers to ensure that they're acting on biodiversity knowledge and insight. So we have worked with policymakers and contribute to global policy agendas, with businesses, with financial institutions and scientists and many others. So what we're really about trying to do is just to ensure that more and more decisions are science-based and science-informed, and then that has good benefits for nature and also for people as well. So we have a very long-standing history of working with businesses, and the main mechanism by which we've done that is through our Proteus partnership. So this essentially is a broad-based partnership of businesses with UNEP-WCMC, where we can start to work with that group and think about what are those opportunities for business to manage their impacts and dependencies, but also more positively contribute towards global biodiversity goals. And we really see this as kind of a vehicle for ensuring that business can contribute to a clean, healthy, resilient environment for all. As part of, as Ash mentioned, there's lots of different things out there. There's lots of different things that are needed. And we see Proteus as one of those mechanisms in collaboration with that whole host of things that are needed. But what we really want to do through Proteus is work with companies to support their decision making on biodiversity and enable their contributions towards global goals and nature positive. So at the moment, we're working with 16 different multinational companies, primarily from the energy, mining, and steel sectors. And a core part of what we do is really joining the dots between that global biodiversity data and tools, but how they can be used in the context of company management practices, company decision making around biodiversity. And we try and tackle this kind of holistic need for action on nature. It's not just about having the data, but it's about how that's integrated in the company and how the company engages on this topic more broadly throughout the business and beyond. So we work with our partners to define different goals for Proteus, and then we structure our activities around that. So firstly, we help our companies to recognise that business case for nature and also communicate that outside of the biodiversity sustainability teams into the wider business to enable that more kind of cross-business action. A core part of our work is around decision support tools and data. So how can we leverage the Proteus partnership to invest and support, maintain and improve different global data sets and tools? And then ultimately, how can we help the companies use that data in the context of their own operations and in turn improve their corporate performance? We have a lot of engagement in the global policy agendas as UNEP-WCMC. So a core part of our work is helping companies navigate what's going on in those agendas and understand any implications for business. And then finally, the cross-sectoral piece is really key for us. So how can we bring together these different businesses from different sectors, have sharing, peer learning, case studies, knowledge exchange through different forums? So we really see this as a broad package of support that we can provide to companies. But it's hard, there's still a lot of focus on the tools and data and how they can be used. So some of the core flagship areas that we have through Proteus is access to protected planet or the World Database on Protected Areas, the IBAC tool, Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool. We have an open source biodiversity A to Z, which is essentially just key terms, glossary, acronyms related to biodiversity, which we update really regularly. We have a platform for access to different marine and coastal data sets and knowledge through Ocean Plus Habitats. We have our own webpage where we can have a back catalogue of resources that we develop for partners. And we also connect businesses into our UNEP-WCMC resources portal, where there's a vast array of different knowledge products, data, guidelines report that we generate across UNEP-WCMC. But through Proteus, what we're able to do as well is listen to those different common needs that we hear from businesses and use that to direct some of our resources into creating information that responds to those. So I've drawn on the example here around International Finance Corporation Performance Standard 6 and creating data sets that are aligned with that performance standard. So essentially, we heard that what would be useful is having a more global screening layer to look at the presence of different types of habitat that could inform entry-level decision-making aligned with IFC Performance Standard 6. So on the left here is the critical habitat layer, which was updated fairly recently. And then to the right, we have a natural modified habitat layer. So these look globally at likely potential presence of these types of habitat and can inform initial desk-based screening for potential presence of these areas. And this is really as a precursor for more detailed site analysis to actually validate these results on the ground. But what we find is it just gives some really useful starting insights for companies to use as part of their alignment with those performance standards. Then IBAC has been mentioned a few times already. So just to kind of touch on what this is, Essentially, IBAT functions as an alliance between 4 global leading conservation organisations: Conservation International, IUCN, BirdLife International, and UNEP-WCMC. And essentially, IBAT looks to bring together some of the most globally authoritative biodiversity data on protected areas, key biodiversity areas, and species into one platform that has mapping visualization functionality. It has reporting that really helps provide access to critical biodiversity information, both to our kind of GIS technical specialists, but also to a broader user base as well. So IBAT is something we make available to our Proteus partners, but is also obviously available independently of that and has many different users from different businesses, financial institutions, and beyond. So just to try and bring this all a bit together as to what does this mean, how do we actually start to use this data for a company context? So what we've done here is draw together a hypothetical case study that's looking at a multinational energy company who wants to expand their onshore wind portfolio. In this scenario, they've identified a potential site in Chad, Africa, and they want to make sure that the site is compatible with their corporate level commitment to achieve net positive impact for biodiversity. So one of the ways in which we've supported our Proteus partners is helping look at those corporate level methodologies to net positive impact and just providing reviews, inputs, recommendations based on our expertise. So then in this scenario, the company has a broad strategy and methodology, and they identify key triggers such as critical habitat, protected areas, and threatened species. So what then the company will look to do is to take that potential site and overlay it with the different types of biodiversity data that's available to inform their triggers for MPI. And this will be really part of a pre-feasibility assessment. I mean, what's really important is, we need to have insights that inform activities before they happen and before they're committed to. So that pre-feasibility stage before we actually go into site application is really important to understand potential sensitivities, triggers, if a site could actually go ahead and be functionally operational as well. So in this case study, the site flags that it's very close to potential critical habitats, as we can see on the left graph. And this also overlaps with a protected area as well within 1 kilometre distance. And it also flags triggers of various threatened species that are around. So at this very early stage, the company is starting to see where there could be potential issues, risks, impacts associated with deployment of this operation. So then what the company will want to do is to get some more information. What does that mean? What's triggering it? What does that mean for our business? What might we need to do differently? What might we need to consider? So through IBAT, there's potential to generate various reports. In this scenario, we've generated a Performance Standard 6, ESSS 6 report to try and identify some more nuance around what might be those triggers for those important areas and those important species. So what they've found through this is that there is a protected area and a key biodiversity area which are overlapping within 1 kilometre from the site. It identifies that this is a trigger for potential critical habitat, so further assessments should be needed on there. And through the report, they can also find out more information on the type of key biodiversity area, flagging this as an important bird and biodiversity area. And then what they can do is start to think about, well, what are some of the threatened species that could be nearby our site that we could impact, that could need to trigger our MPI commitment around how we ensure more positive gains for these types of species. So through the report, they can identify different critically endangered and endangered species that are potentially within 50 kilometres of the site. And then this triggers the 8 species that we see on the screen here, including some really important bird species. So there's a Sacre falcon, an Egyptian vulture, and a lappet-faced vulture. And this is important because we all know wind farms can have big impacts on bird species and cause their declines through collisions, through fragmenting their habitat, causing barriers to movement. So that will be something the site really needs to consider as part of its avoidance measures, how it can operate effectively. And also just generally the key biodiversity area itself is home to at least 267 species from last records and various migratory water birds. So again, there'll be additional impacts as well on top that the site needs to consider. And then they can also start to use the IBAT STAR report, which is the species threat abatement and restoration metric, to start to think about that wider landscape view. So what are the other things that are happening in this area that might cause particular pressures to different species in the vicinity? And what might that mean for the company trying to design an MPI commitment that could be at risk from being achieved due to those other actors in the landscape? So this really gives an additional lens for decision making to think about, well, what are those steps for engagement? What are those other pressure reduction measures we need to consider? Where are those opportunities to add more through additional conservation actions into the landscape to help restore and abate threats to those species? But all of this is just a starter for decision making. We see that global information gives a really good indication of what some of the impacts and pressures might be. But it's really important to refine this through local level information and data, including engagement with local communities is super important. And it's through that combination with site level information that the organisation can start to set a more detailed baseline, they can start to scope out their actions, and they can start to think about how they validate their information and actions with those different local stakeholders, importantly also Indigenous peoples and local communities. So just to summarise, essentially by combining global data with local information, we can really start to understand the site-specific context and what kind of issues might be around the site, but also ensuring that's combined with local stakeholder engagement to get a richer picture, making sure there are ways in which to target interventions where there's most significant potential for positive impact and reduction of pressures, making sure we're considering the wide base in the landscape of different territories, protected areas, other effective conservation measures managed by different groups, linking spatial data with the on-the-ground assessments, including natural capital assessments to really quantify those impacts and dependencies, and ultimately channel this into more specific site-level targets and performance measurements towards the net positive impact commitment. So I'll end there, Hamza, and hand back to you at this point.
Passing the baton to you, could you please highlight the learnings from the Development Corridors Partnership Project, specifically around EIAs, NSEAs, and also while building on that, share how data could be used to deliver these studies effectively?
Well, I will. Okay, good. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to talk about lessons learned from a large project that looked into the social and environmental impacts of development corridors in East Africa. And this picture that you see here is one of the first pictures I took when I visited one of the project sites. And you can see that lioness there looking at the infrastructure in the Nairobi National Park. And you might wonder what she's thinking. And for me, I like to think that she's thinking that this is either a threat or an opportunity. And through this presentation, I invite you to think about it. And we can have an answer to that at the end, or at least my view on this at the end. So what was the Development Corridors Partnership? It was a multi-year project funded by the UK government, 11 institutions, over 50 researchers, and it included researchers from the UK, China, Tanzania, and Kenya. But all our studies or our field work was in Kenya and Tanzania. And specifically, we focused on 3 corridors, development corridors. A development corridor is a large, often transnational, often linear geographical area targeted for infrastructure investment. So it's basically a big initiative or a program where there's loads of infrastructure projects, roads, railways, dams that are developed under a common strategy or with a common goal. That is usually sustainable development, or at least development. Sustainable is a difficult word. So we did look at these corridors in detail in Kenya. Lapsset corridor. We also look at the standards gauge railway. That's most of it is already being built, and it was being built while we were doing the work. And we explored much less the Mtwara corridor in southern Tanzania. You see that the red lines are the corridors, and the green polygons are protected areas. So very crowded landscape, very interesting case studies. So after 4 years on this project, I'm not going to summarize all the evidence or anything, but we had over 148 outputs, including books, policy briefs, reports, scientific papers, data sets, and 32 workshops. And I say involving 750 experts because unfortunately for 15 workshops, we did not record the participants. So it's probably much more than 750, but we can only confirm 750 experts in Kenya and Tanzania being engaged in the process. And you have everything there in the link if you want to explore all these resources. So what did we learn through this project? The first thing that we learned is about the impact assessment process. If you want to think about data to inform environmental impact assessment, you need to understand the process. And in the case of the development corridors, we developed a kind of ideal flow of steps that are not and are usually never linear. They are iterative, and it starts with concept planning. Then the plan needs to be approved, and then there's construction and implementation of hard infrastructure, which are usually roads, railways, ports, whatever it includes, and then soft infrastructure, which is policies and regulations in place, or partnerships and collaborations that can make possible that corridor. And the last one, which hardly never exists, is monitor and evaluation. Are we meeting the targets we defined for us? Is the corridor performing economically or whatever the parameters were, or is it not? The commission upgrading legacy issues. So where does impact assessment lie? So there's two ways of looking at this. First is the strategic environmental impact assessment, all policies, programs, and plans, which mainly could work on the concept planning stage. And this is where Kate and others were mentioning avoiding impact. So in very early stages, if you do a strategic environmental assessment, you should be able to avoid a lot of impacts and issues. If you look in carefully detail at a strategic level, what are you doing, why are you doing it, and how is it going to affect people and wildlife? And then each of these hard infrastructure projects, it's a project in itself. So those will need to follow a similar workflow, and this is what we call environmental impact assessment. So we have two ways of using data here at different scales. We have environmental impact assessment and strategic environmental impact assessments. And in an ideal world, strategic environmental assessment should inform environmental assessment. So when you do an environmental assessment on a new road, you should look at the policy plan or program of infrastructure development of the country. I'm aware that this barely exists in many places, but some places, some kind of strategic plans of infrastructure exist. And that's the first entry point for biodiversity data or any data, also social data. So what are the things we learned? So recently we published a paper where we summarize what we learned through the partnership. It was published, you have the link there, and we identified 8 challenge areas that should improve to deliver sustainable and inclusive development corridors. And I'm not going to describe all of them because we're talking about data today, but it's really important that you know the context and the issues to then know what data you need, at what scale, and what resolution, and to inform which decisions. So here you can see the 8 challenges that we identified is that there was a poor application of existing best practice and guidance on biodiversity, on impact assessments. and that resulted in poorer outcomes for people and nature. So the impact assessment processes, although in paper there are regulations in place, they were not being implemented properly, and that resulted in poorer outcomes for both people and nature. Another thing that Kate mentioned that I really think it's needed, there was a lack of coherence across national, local, and international planning. So there was no interaction between different departments or different global, national, and regional goals. And that made the process very inefficient. And also they were stepping on each other's toes when doing these things. And then there was loads of issues around governance, inclusivity, and equality. Communities that were meant to benefit from these corridors were not being benefited. In fact, they were being marginalized. There was a lot of, in some cases, elite groups were being getting all the benefit from these undertakings. The impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services were not identified properly, and if they were not identified properly, then you cannot design proper mitigation measures nor monitor if your mitigation measures are working. So there was a lack of use of the appropriate data to identify impacts, then design mitigation measures, and then apply corrective measures or monitoring to see if it's working. And then there was a lot about the infrastructure and not always considering the future risks. So what Kate was saying about dynamic assessments, no dynamic assessment, not many of them looking at climate risks, looking at water risks, but also looking at biodiversity risks like fragmentations of landscapes, loss of biodiversity. So there was a lot of that lacking. So if I have to summarize this in a very simple and bold sentence, we know what we need to do, but we're not doing it. We know the data we need to use, we know how to do it properly, but we're not doing it. And from a data perspective, yeah, so what are the data-related questions on impact assessment? So first is data on what? We need data as the ecosystem services, physical data about conservation sites, about areas of importance, and about existing infrastructure. That's an important point that, do we need new infrastructure or do we need to upgrade the existing one? Then data for what? So as I said before, to inform actions to avoid, mitigate, restore, or compensate for impacts. This is called the mitigation hierarchy. It's been here for around 30 years, and now it's being improved into other approaches that other colleagues have been talking about. Nature positive approach, it does integrate this as well. Identification of impacts and design of mitigation measures, monitoring and reporting on impacts, which is what TNFD mainly does at the moment. And then data for whom? Who needs the data? So we were talking here about project proponents, with project funders, so those that put money into the infrastructure and need to make sure that they are not incurring in risks, and so that's another area. Impact assessment consultants as well, they need the data. Impact assessment agencies who approve the impact assessment as well, but also the project implementers, engineers have already been designing, but those companies are hired to build infrastructure, usually ignore everything that's been done previously. So it's really important. Data for whom, and then data from where do you get the data from? So I agree that online tools for high-level screening like iPads or the Global Forest Watch or ENCORE, all these tools that allow you to avoid and identify what are your impacts, potential impacts and dependencies are really important. But I think also, as Kate said, I'm mentioning Kate a lot because I did agree with her a lot. We need to harness the power of artificial intelligence to manage and interpret data. We need to make accessible data from thousands of completed impact assessments all over the world. There's a really interesting project from Juffe that they're trying to do that at a small scale to learn from that. And of course, we also need data from field surveys, because once you get into mitigation and monitoring, you do need to go to the ground. And for that, you need people to monitor, or drones, or any other technological advance is really important. often we forget about the stages of implementation of the impact assessment and monitoring of the impact assessment, where many impacts occur because what was done previously is not implemented. So my 6 take-home messages are, I think we do need to, the infrastructure sector needs to embrace online platforms for high-level assessments, because biodiversity impact assessment generally are very low quality or near existence and don't follow best practice. I also would like to say that, as my colleague has said, more data does not equal better decisions. You have to consider the context, the resolution, the scale, and the communication of the results. So what you find out and how you communicate that is key. And for me, the mitigation hierarchy is the absolute minimum you need to use to guide your data needs. Online tools are fundamental to avoid impacts, but as I said before, as you zoom into your site, you can't use those tools anymore. Stacey also mentioned that you need to get into the details to design the mitigation measures and follow all the other steps of the mitigation hierarchy. One thing that I think is really important is to move from a reactive to a proactive approach. So reactive approach is you identify impacts and you mitigate impacts. A more proactive approach is to focus on desired outcomes. What do we want out of this landscape and how can we achieve that together? So in a way, you design the infrastructure with conservation objectives in mind, not only with infrastructure objectives in mind. And this applies also for people. So instead of react to impacts, just be proactive and plan for a future you desire. And as I said before, the interaction between strategic environmental assessment and environmental assessment is really important, that data flows through these two processes and that is open access and transparent. And as I mentioned before, Juffe, if you don't know who Juffe is, they are working on a project looking into this. Juffe is it's that the map is not a territory. That's one of my favorite sentences, because we need to consider who is living there, the local people that might be impacted or benefit by the infrastructure, and we often leave this aside. And I think a more holistic approach, looking at the interaction between nature and people, it's really important, but zooming into the territory. So that's all I wanted to say. And in the answer to what this tiger might be thinking about, I think that infrastructure development, as Kate said, it's an opportunity and a threat at the same time. It's both. So it could be a threat if we don't do it properly, but we have a huge opportunity to design the infrastructure in a way that it's more sustainable and that we get benefits from it, for nature and for people. So thank you very much. And that's the end of my presentation.